All right. For attendance will be extra credit since you guys are all here early. It'll be flood in honor of the lecture back in Hamblin after it got flooded. So flood is the first attendance, and like I said, that is some extra credit for you guys. Of course, if you're watching this as a video, that's just one of your regular old words. But if you're live streaming, you're in person, it's an extra credit word. He's here, Morgan's here, Kylie's here, A is also here. Online, that is, we're online. Burton is online. Kinder is online. Fisher is online. I think I already said Cooper. Let me double check. Yes, Cooper is online. Isabel's been online. All right, that's everybody so far. Excuse me. Julia is here. Kincaid is online. Let's see. So you guys have any? Isn't comes in late is going to miss anything. I will say live video, so it makes no sense, at least on your part. But you can if you want. The exam is due Friday. Good morning.
Good morning.
So Madeline is here. online. All right. So I'm going to do attendance. Obviously, you don't necessarily need to worry because words. Now, so in theory, me who was online and what time they got on and what time they left. Anyway, if you're online, don't call your names. Hale is not here. Kincaid is online. Not here. Mullins is not here. Lewis is not here. And Melton, not be here. Is online. Reinhardt, not here. Isabel's on. Julie is here. And online. Sorry, good grief. So to back up, Mullins is here. Talbert's not here. Online. Larissa's online. Hughes is online. Galloway's not here. Cook is. Bergen is online. Burton is. Sanders online. Not here. Canterbury is here. And Fisher's online. Now. Let's jump into it very quickly because it's now 8:01. And we have catching up. So we left off Weinberg. And you should already be a little, because this is what you sort of did in last week's lab, the one with the Hardy Weinberg lab. Actually, sorry, the first word for attendance is going to be sick, since I was really sick on Monday. Anyway, so yeah, we talked about this. I gave an example in that last example. So the for the exam, because I might or might not have you do some basic math, right? In the genotype frequencies. So let's talk about the genotype frequencies to start with, right? So for example, we didn't do that one in lab, but talked about it a few times. So you know that having freckles is the dominant, right? So if I were to say, I don't know, 60% of our class has freckles, you would write that as 0.6 under here for the p squared, because that represents a dominant homozygous, right? So if I said 60% of the people who have got freckles and they're homozygous dominant, then let's say at 0.4 of them in our class have freckles, but they're heterozygous, right? Then figure out by doing some basic math what are recessive homozygous. Well, add up to 100%, right? When you add those up, well, that's a whole. Let's not say that. Well, sure. So that's one, right? So then that means there were 0 recessive homozygous. Example I wanted to give, but the math, that would be a very rare situation. But you guys see what I'm saying? Math. Again, that's the genotype. Alleles would be more. We're talking about freckles. How many big Fs are in the gene pool, and how many small Fs. That equal 1. And if we were to do some other numbers, and I'll use something different than, let's say, I don't know, 0.7, like 70% of the alleles in the class were dominant, and then are recessive. 0.7 equals 1, and the answer is 0.3. So it had to be basic math like that on the exam. At the very least, know the difference between frequencies and allele frequencies, and know that p squared represents recessive, and the 2pq represents homozygous. I would take questions, but let me move forward first. Let me show you how this is applied. This is going to be a slightly complicated example, especially since I'm going to go through it so quickly. Let's talk about why it's important. Population genetics and health science. figure out how many people are affected by certain diseases. And this is an example from the book, is a disease called PKU that I'm not going to ask you any questions about. As a matter of fact, I'm not even going to talk about the disease itself, because the example I'm trying to give you is with the numbers. So we can use some basic algebra to figure things out, right? So if there's 1 in 10,000 babies born in the United States, which there are for that disease, then we could use a formula to figure other stuff out. So again, 1 in 10,000, if you were to write that as a decimal, would be 0.0001, right? So we know Q squared equals 0.001, because I just said 1 out of 10,000 babies have it, right? And it's a recessive condition. Therefore, again, Q squared equals that. And again, I'm going through this quickly. If you don't get it, don't worry about it. I'm not going to test you on this. This is just an example. But if you take the algebraically, take the square root of both sides between Q squared and 0.001, then that gives you Q equals 0.01. So then to solve for Q, to solve for P, you could say 1 minus Q equals P. Again, if I had more time, I would show you this algebraically, but that's not the point here. And then therefore we could figure out that P equals 0.99. And then with that, now that we know P, already knew Q, you can plug that in to PQ, and that gives you the number of heterozygotes. So that gives you the number of carriers in the population, right? So now we know, obviously we already know how many babies have it, and we know how many people don't have it. So therefore, using the Hardy-Weinberg formula, we can figure out how many carriers there are. And again, that's just an example. I know that's very quick. Sorry if that confused you. And if for some reason you are interested in that, you can go watch the earlier version of this video that I made, or you can meet me on office hours and I can explain it slower. All right, let's talk about microevolution as a change in a gene pool. So the good news is here, this is also kind of a review because we've already done this in last week's lab. And I talked about this briefly, but a non-evolving population is known as something in genetic equilibrium. It's also known as the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So you already know what the Hardy-Weinberg formula is, or are, if you could. We talked about those two different formulas, right? But yeah, so when they're at equilibrium, basically what we're saying is they're not changing, right? The gene pool is not changing. The allele frequencies aren't changing. The genotype frequencies aren't changing. Everything's staying the same. And as I mentioned in lab last week, that's completely hypothetical. It's completely academic. This thing doesn't really happen in real life. But we'll talk about it anyway. Let's keep. Here we go. The method of evolution, as far as going to know the different and the two subcategories, and gene flow, natural selection we've already talked about, and we'll talk about again. So as we're learning these pools, make sure you understand that are going to go is I'm going to say, I'm not going to ask you the definition of genetic drift or gene flow or whatever, but I'll probably give you an example, and then those will be your multiple choices, right? Is it genetic drift? Is it bottleneck? Is it founder? Is it gene flow? So be able to recognize a hypothetical situation as one of these things that I'm about to teach you about. So again, like I said in the last lab when I talked about this briefly, evolution isn't always big changes. It isn't one species changing. Again, the lab we used, you had a population of fish. Some of them were white, some of them were orange, some of them were spotted. And through time, after generation, the percentages, right, the frequencies, the ratio of those changed. The species didn't change. It was still the same. But those individuals did change. The percentage, frequency, or ratio of them did. So first thing I'm going to talk about is genetic drift. And that is a change in the gene pool, change in gene pool due to chance. Right, so know that, right? So again, it's not like natural selection. Moths, those things didn't turn black by chance because predators were eating them. Now, don't get me wrong, they first out by chance, right? There was that one white mutation. So then when it had offsprings, they were black, right? By chance. You might say that things getting dark because of pollution was by chance. So you might say that was on purpose. Whatever. That was natural selection, right? That was not genetic drift. Here's a good example from your old textbook. Here's a random population of 2, 3, 7, 8, 9 red flowers. There's only one white type frequencies. and the allele frequency 70% dominant and 30%. So then by ones that are in the square, those are the ones in that generation. The offspring. So generation, the right now we're 50-50. 50% recessive. Those are just the ones that happen to make. And again, in this generation, there's squares around that happen to make. So then we have the third generation. And by the third generation, you can see here the gotten rid of all recessive alleles, and now they're all dominant. Again, this was by there was no sexual, there was no input from flowers places, right? This was all, and that's what makes it. So any questions about what drift is? Okay, so let's see. By chance, so there's two subcategories of genetic drift. You might recognize those by a hypothetical situation that I give you on. But also, please remember that these two things are subcategories of genetic drift. And the first one is the bottleneck effect. Again, it's an example of genetic drift. It happens to be in population size. So specific case of when you have a drastic, and that's why it's called a bottleneck, because the population is passing through a bottleneck. And you end with a few. And on the next slide, I'm going to, it helps. Yeah. But the thing is, when you the population size drastically, obviously it is bad that you're losing a bunch of your population, but not only that, losing genetic variability, right? So you're losing a lot of stuff. Sometimes by alleles just might be completely gone, right? You might. So there's your original population, that bottle full of marbles, or what you can see the purple ones and green ones, and yeah, by the looks of it, it looks kind of equal. I don't know. There's not many orange. It goes through the, so only a few of them make it, and there's no advantage, right? There's no advantage of being a purple or orange marble. It's you know, those are the ones. And by chance, the surviving population just happens with no oranges, right? That orange allele went extinct, and that was completely by chance. So yes, that is a great visualization of the bottleneck. Marbles are not living organisms. Any questions about? Which I guess the next word for attendance will be bottle. Your book does give this example. Well, I'm definitely not going to require you to memorize this example. But again, this is the come and say, here's what happened. You have to recognize that's genetic. Well, it is. We have found grief, the bottleneck effect. So, memorize this. I would give you a different example. But anyway, this example, chief experience at least genome. The last one years ago, last 1,000 years ago, again in the 1800s, when they were kind of basically eliminated because they were killing livestock, right? So the problem here is, again, I'm going to ask you this, but the population got decimated by numbers, sure, but the problem is you lost a lot of that genetic variability, and you need genetic variability. Forward semester. Hold on, let me. I heard a noise. How many of you know anybody who died from COVID-19? You do? I know somebody. Obviously, there was a lot of people on the news. How many of you died from COVID-19? None of you, right? How many of you had it? I did too. Which I guess you don't have to answer that. That's HIPAA. Sorry, I should have mentioned that first. But yes, I've had it. The point being, Some people, it really affects them. Some people barely got affected at all. Some people died. I'm sure you, all of these above, right? Genetic variability. I mean, there's other factors of. Imagine if, think about the people who did die of 19, and imagine if it was primarily for genetic reasons, and imagine if humans had gone through a bottleneck, like a big, maybe World War II turned out worse than it did, right? We went through this huge bottleneck, and it so happens, it turns out that the people who survived to be genetically resistant or genetically susceptible to COVID-19. Now here we are. A few years ago, that would have wiped, right? Because we would have lost that genetic variability. That's just an example. Obviously, you don't need to know anything about that. So any questions about the bottleneck? There's nothing I can do that let me know. The microphone's on my laptop. This microphone here. Sorry, guys. I wish I could do more. But bottleneck effect, a subcategory of genetic, very common, not to say common sense, but it's simple to understand. At least the name makes sense. The founder effect. It's when a few individuals colonize an isolated habitat. I'd argue that this is kind of like a bottleneck, except bottleneck, you lost a lot of population because a bunch of things died. In this case, it's not that you lost a lot of the other population, it's just that you took that small subset of population and somewhere from the rest of the population. So, as your book says, it represents genetic drift in a new colony. These are just examples. I'm not going to ask you about them. Again, I would give some hypothetical example on the exam, and you need to recognize it as founder effect. But if you click these links on the PowerPoint, you can watch little videos about that. So, for example, I'm going to give this one example. I'll give this one example to move forward. Amish people, I like this as a great example because it is genetic in a new colony, but usually when people think of founder effect, they think of isolation, right? Like the Pingalap, you can read about that. Literally people who went that way. I like using the Amish as an example because they're not geographically isolated. You can go around and see them, not necessarily here, but kind of close to here. But they are culturally isolated, right? So they are amongst us, but they're kind of thing, and there's not a lot of breeding going in and out between the population and their population, right? So their gene pool is pretty much isolated. For that reason, they have disorders that most people don't have because, again, they had that one that was kind of removed from the rest of the population. Anyway, you can look into that. And again, I'm sorry, I'll give you one last example. The Martha's Vineyard thing off of the coast of Massachusetts. And it just so happens the people that founded that island, there happened to be a slightly higher percentage of people who are deaf. So because of that, to this day, they have a percentage of deaf people. Matter of fact, that's where American Sign Language originated. But anyway, those are just examples. Any founder effect? All right. Gene flow is the next one. This one is simple too. It's in the name. It's when genes too. Your book, I forget about this. Your textbook calls it migration. So either one, migration, it's the same thing. I've always learned it as the old textbook called it gene flow. Your textbook calls it migration. So it's immigration with an E, right? It's things coming in and out of a population. A genetic exchange with another population. Sometimes having things coming in, more alleles, possibly, but if you're having things leave, then you're getting fewer alleles. And again, this is all by. But the one thing, if I were to give you a hypothetical example, this bullet point is definitely one that I would probably include. Probably, I just said. Anyway, it reduces the genetic differences between populations, right? So if you have two, bird colonies on islands that are pretty far away, they're far away enough where they don't exchange populations a lot, but they're close enough where it happens occasionally, would be fewer differences. Maybe on one island, they're really dark and they're the same species, and on the other island, and they're the same species, they start swapping. maybe they start becoming more middle. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click this bullet point right here where it says another, see something about gene flow. But again, some example of things migrating and genetic information being shared amongst and reducing the genetic differences between them. Now we go back to looking at natural selection again, a closer look at natural selection. So, of all the things we talked about, it's only natural selection that leads to an adaptive evolution, right? It's only one that leads to something being more fit for their environment, right? That's what when we say adaptive evolution, right? That means they're, well, more fit, right? There's a better fit there. They fit in better. Your book gives this example. As always, I'm not going to test you on examples. You don't need to memorize any of this. But the blue-footed booby is one excellent example of adaptation for its home. So its body and its bill are streamlined like a torpedo, which makes sense because the way it hunts is it flies around, hovers over the ocean until it sees some fish at once, and it kind of dive bombs. So it needs to be quick. It needs to be quick in the air. It needs to be quick in the water. And it has a body and a bill that are streamlined for that. Also, it's a bird, not a fish, right? So it can't breathe underwater. So yeah, it wants to hit the water fast and hard, which will cause it to go deep, but it needs to not go too deep because birds can't fly or breathe underwater. And that's what the large tail fin is for, right? It's got a big old tail that helps slow it down. And then I don't know, the reason I don't like this example is because this bullet point right here happens to be sexual selection, not natural selection, but females prefer the males that have brightest blue feet. So that's an example of sexual selection. We'll come back to that. But all the other stuff, that's a great example of natural selection, right? So if you look at it, that's the way it looks. So they all have a little bit of variations. If a bird is a little bit larger than that, it probably eats a little bit less well and probably therefore mates a little bit less, therefore has less offspring, right? One is nice and streamlined, therefore it's eating better than the larger bird. So it's healthier than the larger bird. So it's procreating more than the larger bird. So there's more offspring with those genes than the one of the larger bird. And over generations and time, it's going to change the population to be more streamlined. Any questions about that example? All right. Let's talk about evolutionary fitness again. We kind of skirted on it. Let's really jump into it. Fitness will be the next word for attendance. Fitness.
The extra credit for us.
Yeah, good question. If you're in person, that's just extra credit. If you're online, those are your words for attendance. So what is relative fitness? It is the contribution an individual makes to a gene pool relative to the contribution of other individuals. In a sense, you might say it's how many babies they're making. This is why I don't like that term survival of the fittest, because you'll hear that a lot when you talk about natural selection, but that's only half the story. It doesn't matter if you're surviving. If you're not passing along those genes, it doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, if somehow you could figure out if there was something happening in the population where an individual was just having a bunch of offspring and then dying, that they wouldn't be surviving, but they'd be passing down offspring. Therefore, there would be a high relative fitness. Any questions about relative fitness? And more than likely, it's not that I'm going to test you on that word. It's just that we're going to use that word, and you need to know what it means. So let's talk about the 3 general outcomes of natural selection. In my mind, this one's always made sense to me when I was a student, when I first learned about it. And for some reason, it clicked, and I always think it's going to click for everyone else, but sometimes people have problems with it. But here's an example. If we were to graph the coat color of a population of mice, we would get a bell-shaped curve. And you'll see what I mean when I show you the next slide. If natural selection favors certain colors over others, as natural selection sometimes does, then the population will change over generations. And there's only 3 general outcomes possible when natural selection works, population. And here's what they are: directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. This is going to make a lot when I show you the graphs. So I will really quickly read what's on the screen, but we'll actually talk about these words that are on the screen. Direction is a shift in population by selecting in favor of one extreme phenotype. That's right. The average human, I think, is 5'6". A bunch of people who are average size. There's even fewer really tall, even
short, right? That if over time humans get taller and taller and taller, or for that matter, even shorter, 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 as long as they're going in one of those extreme directions, that would be an example of directional selection. We're selecting in the direction of one of the extreme phenotypes. Disruptive selection leads to a balance between two or more contrasting phenotypes. So using the same example, if average size humans, if the number of average size humans starts going down, but then we also start getting a lot of tall people and short people, that's disruptive selection. Now it's sort of like directional selection, but instead of favoring one extreme phenotype, we're kind of favoring both extreme phenotypes. And we're starting to see less of that middle phenotype. And then finally, the opposite of disruptive selection is stabilizing selection. In this case, we're getting even fewer of the extremes. So we're getting fewer and fewer tall people, fewer and fewer short people in this example, and even more average size people. So before I take your questions, here's the graphs. It should make a lot of sense, right? There's the original population of mice. See them up there. There's a lot of those middle color ones. There's very few dark ones, very few light ones. Let's just say something happens in the environment. I don't know. Maybe they live on an island that's covered with snow, but it's also a volcanic island. So there's a lot of black. There's a lot of gray. But then let's say that volcano becomes more active, and now things start getting covered a little bit more ash, a little bit more of lava. It turns black once it turns to stone. So then it'd be easier for dark mice to hide, right? So in this case, it starts selecting towards the darker mice. That would be mind you, it could also go the other way, right? If there's a different situation and maybe is a new ice age, volcanic island was just completely covered in ice, and now there's really no advantage to being dark at all, then it would start going the other way. But if it's one or the other, that's directional selection. Disruptive selection, again, this is where we see an increase in the extreme phenotype, so a lot of dark ones, a lot of light ones, and we have a decrease in the middle phenotype. And of course, the opposite of that would be stabilizing selection. So here again, we have even more almost definitely. The way these questions are going to go is I'm going to give you some hypothetical situation, right? The population started as this, and then over a few generations, you need to reckon. So any questions about those three? More likely than others to obtain mates. There's two different types. There's intersexual competition, and there's intersexual selection of mates. I'll talk about both of those moving forward. And that's not necessarily that I'm probably not even getting into that deep and have you differentiate between the two for the exam. Talk about them. There's something you need to know. It's called sexual dimorphism. That is the distinction in appearance between males and females, and it's not directly associated with reproduction or survival. So like, for example, cardinals. I'm sure you've seen cardinals. Those are the males. The dull red ones, pinkish, orangish, those are the females. There's a difference between the male and the females. Some species have secondary sex structures with members of the same sex. Usually, those are males competing with other males to have sex with a female. If we had more time to talk about it, we would. It should make a lot of sense considering how many gametes females produce, right? Like hypothetically, a human male, I don't even know the numbers. Like I would be curious to see how many people a male human in the same time period that one female could get pregnant and have a baby before they could have another, right? It's at least 9 months, right? So imagine how many people a male human could impregnate in that time frame. So that's why it's usually the males competing for the females. But if we had more time to talk about it, we would. Anyway, sexual selection is pretty straightforward. That bird on the right that's more colorful is the male. The one on the left is the female. Then you have on the right those two bighorn sheep. Anyway, they're competing for the female. And I wish we had more time to talk about it because yes, it's sexual selection, but a lot of times sexual selection is at least slightly tied in. It's going to be, in theory, a healthier male and therefore pass along its bigger, healthier, stronger genes. Again, this is from your old textbook. Your old textbook always ends with something called the evolution section. I'm leaving it on the PowerPoints because it is worth reading about this. It is really important though, especially this. Matter of fact, time to talk about it, even on it. Antibiotic resistance. This is why when you take antibiotics and they give direct, you take it for the full 10 days, even when you start to feel better. The reason is once you start feeling good, almost, I'm gonna say immediately, but start feeling better because most of the viruses have died, so you feel better. Even though you feel better, there's some viruses that are getting killed. I keep saying viruses, bacteria. Some of that infection is still getting killed, and if you stop taking the just because what's happened is those bacteria that survived that first round of antibiotics, strong ones. So you killed all the weak ones, and now the only ones you have left are if you stop taking those antibiotics, then that new population that's in you is going to be resistant to the antibiotics because those are the ones that survived. Anyway, let's jump into the next chapter. While I'm doing that, let's next attendance word. Since I said we'll jump into the next chapter, the next attendance word. Life. So this chapter, chapter 12, used to be one chapter. Skip ahead to the other one. We need to skip ahead. Chapter 12, like I said, yes, like I just said, chapter 11 and chapter 12 in the last chapter in the bind. So that's why the one we just finished, the chapter 11 PowerPoint that we just finished, it combines both. Right? So when you're studying the chapter 11 PowerPoint, you're going to and you're so that brings us to all the way to chapter 19. You can see we're skipping a lot. So take note of that. What is it?
Exam 3 is open.
No. Yes. Good question. To remind you, not only exam 3 open, it's been open since last Friday and it closes this Friday. And if you need help studying for it, let me know. You have the study. The point being, if you need me and go over the study guides and get all the correct answers and all that, let me know. Ahead of the game. I downloaded the wrong one.
I have a question.
What's the question?
What was the word that you said? You cut off. The attendance word.
The last one was jump.
Jump. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
We're
you.
jumping into the next chapter. There we go. So again, like I said, that we just finished, it contains and chapter 12 from the textbook. So there we go. Now we're really getting into the stuff I find interesting. Education and community ecology. We're really talking about how organisms interact with each other and time for this. We're going to talk about how producing a lot of trash is bad for the environment, as you might know, how the human population is growing, kind of like how they make rules for fisheries, like how many fish are you allowed to catch? All that. So when can you catch them? We're going to talk about all that stuff. So let's just jump in. Again, this is from your old textbook and your old chapter with this thing called Biology and Society. Again, I'm leaving it. I recommend you read it. You on it. It's a really good invasive species. I'm fascinated with invasive species. This particular example is relevant to me because I used to live in the Keys, so this was a thing. I kind of lived through that. Anyway, this chapter I'm teaching this from the old textbook, so it's the same information, different order. Anyway, the way we're going to break it down in this PowerPoint is an overview. Population growth models, applications of population ecology, and then finally human population growth. So here we go, an overview of population ecology. First thing you need to know ecology is, what is a population? This would definitely be a test question. You definitely need to know it. Group of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. Now, this is in your textbook. Define it in slightly different ways, and we will talk about those too. At this point in the textbook, that's how they define it. It's a group of individuals area at the same time, right? So the squirrels that live on WVSU's campus, for some reason, is always the example I give, because they're the same place at the same time. Now the thing is, and this is why this will be important later, individuals in a population rely on the same resources, or they're competing for the same resources, you could even say. They're influenced by the same environmental factors. So again, using those squirrels as an example, if there's a big fire that burns down WVSU's campus, well, every single one of those squirrels would be affected. This is where they live. And they are breed and interact with each other. So this definition from this main bullet point also needs to include these things here. Groups of the same species that live together at the same place at the same time, that are competing for the same resources, influenced by the same environmental factors, and likely to breed with one another. At the beginning of the semester, we talked about things like how the levels of organization, where you start at an atom, and then you get a molecule, and then you get an organelle, then you get a cell, then you get and so on and so forth, right? So at this point, we are now past organisms. We are talking about a population, right? A group of organisms of the same species. So any questions about this slide? All right, then let's talk about what population ecology is, since that's what this chapter is about. Population is concerned with the changes in population size and basically the factors that cause that change, right? So it's all about the change in population size. If you're a population ecologist, you're studying a particular population, whatever it is that you happen to study, and those are the things you're interested in, right? How's that population size changing over time, and what is responsible for that change? And we just populations a few ways. It's usually people are very familiar with this population, right? So I say I live in West Virginia, like 1.8 million people, I think. Not sure about that, right? But that's what population size is. Age structure, we'll talk a lot more about that. For example, structure on campus is a lot different than the age structure. I don't know. I'm not from West Virginia, but we're generally has a lot of older people. Probably in college towns, there probably is a higher percentage of younger people. We could also talk about population density. And again, using human example, we could say, sure, there's 1.8 million in West Virginia, but that's spread out through all of West Virginia, right? Now, what if there's also 1.8 humans in New York City, right? So even if it was the same size, it has a different density, right? Any questions about those three things before we talk about them in more detail? All right. Here's some pictures of population ecologists doing their thing. Those pictures are from the old textbook. Population dynamics. I might ask you what that is, but that is the interaction between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause variations of population size. So I'll come right back to that, but let me back it up for a second. Again, like we said, population ecology is concerned with how the population size things causing the change. And those things causing the change, that's what we call population dynamics. And when it's an abiotic, what that means is living and non-living. The population of squirrels on WVSU's campus, if we were talking about their population dynamics, we could talk about the biotic factors, like probably the feral cats that kill them and eat them. That'd be a living factor. Abiotic factors, right? Probably some of them get squished out on the highway there. Anyway, an important aspect of population is population growth. A picture of the human. the projected population growth, but we'll come. Population ecology plays a key role in applied research. So this is probably a little bit less. I don't want to put an X to that because I don't want to say for sure I'm not going to ask you these. Put a question mark. But this is a little bit less important. This is saying, hey, why does this even matter to us? Why are we learning about this? Well, information conservation projects. It's used to develop fisheries, populations, and it provides insight into controlling how pests and pathogens are spread. And for most of you, that's not really matter at all, right? Most of you aren't going to be developing fisheries or wildlife populations, but voting for people who fund these things or don't fund them, deciding whether you should buy something from this company who, right? So it is a little important for you to know these things, but let's talk about them. Really quick. A good example of this, I think, we'll talk about the fisheries. The fisheries is a great example, and we'll talk about it later. But the first thing we're talking about, which we mentioned earlier, but now we're really going to talk about it. It's the number of individuals of a species, or volume. So again, if you're talking about humans, you might say it's this per square mile, right? If we're talking about bacteria on this table, we might say the number of bacteria per square. Talking about something in the water, we might say it's this many octopus per, cubic meter. But these things are just examples. The only thing I reiterate here is that I think people naturally think of per square, again, humans per square mile, but it's not always per square. It's not a flat thing we're looking at. Sometimes it's three-dimensional. So how do we measure it? So again, I know I keep using humans in our heads, not thinking about the human population because it's kind of an exception. Human population, we just keep track of it, right? At least, especially in the United States. Not only do we have, but we keep track of how many people. Well, in theory, we think we keep track of how many people are coming in, how many people are leaving, we are born, and how many people die, right? So that's humans. And it's actually impractical or impossible to individuals of the population, right? So if you were to look it up, I bet it's possible if you were to look up how many sycamore trees are in Kanawha State Forest, there might be an answer to that. And I can almost guarantee you, whoever figured that out, go out and count every single sycamore tree in the Kanawha State Forest. And they right? So for example, if you're studying birds, obviously it wouldn't be say you're going to go count all the birds, but if you know enough about that bird, territory is, you can count the number of nests. They're not moving. You just count the number of. You can extrapolate and figure out a good represent how many birds there might be. Rodent burrows, again, it's not practical to count all the rodents, but if you know how many rodents live per burrow and again what their range is, then you can count and make an estimate. Same thing with termite mines, etc. Oh, again, just examples. As always, those techniques are just examples. Any questions about that? The picture, right? Those are groundhogs. Think about it. They're always popping in and out. So if you're studying groundhogs, it's difficult to get the actual population size. But if you know enough about and how many live in each hole and things like that, then you can make a good population density. Any questions about that? Let's talk age structure. This would be more important for criminal justice majors, maybe get into politics. Of course, I'm talking about humans again, but population and age structure, those things would all matter if you for the major. We'll talk about that later. What is the age structure of a population? Age groups. So it's just like saying again, oh, how many young people? Oh, here's a lot of babies, but not a lot of adults, right? Again, I'm using humans as an example because that's what we're familiar with, but that's what an age structure is. Again, when we're not thinking about humans, we can use age structure to give us some insights into the history of a population's survival, that on the its reproductive success. Again, I'll give you an example on the next slide, and how the population relates to the environmental factors. So here's a great example from the old textbook. Again, well, I'm not going to test you on this. So again, humans aren't in a good, we really closely the population of humans, right? Especially in the United States. We know how many there are. We know what age they are. We know what race they are. But let's say you're a scientist and you just moved out and you want a bird, whatever kind of bird it is, I don't remember, it doesn't matter. Right? You just now started day one, you start studying these birds. And you're looking at them, you're catching them, you're figuring out how old they are, how many there are, and you figure out, there's less than 10 that are 1 year old. There's none that are 2 or 3 years old. There's a lot of them that are 4 years old, right? You can look at that. You can look at the population, right? And you just now started studying them. Now, by looking at this population right now, looking at this age structure, you can look and say, obviously something really bad for reproduction happened 2 to 3 years ago. Obviously something really good happened 4 years ago. Obviously something really bad happened 10 years ago, right? So you know this now, even though you just started studying. You haven't been there for the past 10 years, but you have a snapshot, at least, of the reproductive success. And now you can look at other research, right? Maybe you can look at climate, because there are, people keep track of climate changes. And maybe you could see that, oh yeah, 2, 3 years ago, there was a big, and 10 years ago, there was a big drought. You can say, oh, this bird must be really susceptible, just as an example. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about life tables and survivorship curves. This goes along with what we're saying. So now we're just talking about basically, you'll see. Life table, a track, which is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. So what we just looked at was not a life table. It does show how many were alive at certain ages, but it's not necessarily a life table. Well, first of all, it's a graph, not a table. So let's talk about life tables. This is a life table of humans in 2008, right? So you can see this is the number. So we're looking at 100,000 individuals for this, right? And out of those 100,000 individuals who were born, we see that 800 died. So from then you could do a little math and figure out the chances of making it to the age 10 for a human in 2008 were 0.992, right? So that means 99.2%. And then, of course, you can see the chances of making it to the age of 20, and the chances of making it to the age of 30 and 40, right? That's basically what we're saying. That's a life. And you can see there the numbers are different. Focus on those numbers all the way to the right, because, again, those are your chances. And you can see right here, the chances really start dropping off right around here, right? From 87, drop down to all the way to 72%. And then the next decade, you drop down to 40%, right? And again, for humans, we already know this. We already know that as humans get old, their chances of survival are less. But imagine, again, you're a scientist studying a population, just started studying this population, you don't know anything about them. This is the kind of information you need to know. If you're developing a fishery and deciding how many fish people can catch and what size they have to be, because the size equals age with fish, generally speaking, then you can figure out, you can have to look at this life table and figure out when they're most vulnerable and say, okay, we'll make sure that fishermen aren't catching them when they're the most vulnerable, right? Makes sense. Any questions about life table? All right, the next thing is called a survivorship curve. It's basically sort of kind of a graph of the life table. It plots the individuals that are still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. So again, imagine just basically trying to have of what I showed you before. Of course, what I showed you before was a percentage. Actually, no, that works too, right? So we're just looking at like the percentage of the population that's still alive at that age. And the interesting thing is we use, again, a percentage, not actual ages, right? So how many of them live to the 100% of the life expectancy? How many live to the 50% of the life expectancy? And the way that's useful is because we can compare different species, right? Humans live a lot longer than oysters and squirrels. But because we're not looking at actual ages, right? So this isn't like 0 to 100 years. This is 0% of life expectancy. This is 50% of life expectancy. This is 100% of life expectancy, right? So we can see humans generally they live a long time, right? It's not until they get towards that end of their life expectancy that they start losing a lot of people. The opposite of that are oysters. You can see oysters, most of them don't even survive to make it, right? To the far into their life expectancy. But the ones that do make it, I mean, they do pretty well. And then there's the middle, which is type 2, and that is pretty consistent throughout the lifespan. When we come back on Friday, we'll finish the conversation about these curves, the survivorship curves. And the last word for attendance, since we've talked about them before and they're on the screen, is squirrel. So that's it. I'll see you on Friday. I'll be in my office online for office hours if you need me.
Have a good one.
You too.